right, thank you all for coming tonight. My name is Isaac Coleman, and I want to give a special thanks to my family, friends, Professor Huffman, in part for the inspiration for what I'll be discussing, as well as some of the information in it. Now, the world powers have always had regions of the world in which they would compete with one another over hegemony. In Africa, the Western world exploited every natural resource they could, up to and including human slave labor. In the Middle East, the world has fought over oil. In the Americas, the world fought over food and mineral resources. With the advent of climate change, a new region of the world is being opened up for exploitation, and that is the Arctic. Now, climate change is a natural cycle that is accelerated by man-made process, which results in an increase in world temperatures overall, which causes warmer climates to shift north and south into the higher latitudes. This has a lot of terrible effects for everyone around the world, including irregular precipitation, which leads to droughts, causing fresh water to dry up. It also leads to an increased severity and frequency of storms. As you can see here, the warmer temperatures have resulted in, for the past 20 years, Arctic ice has reduced by about 50%, which leads to a rise in sea levels, which displaces millions of people. Directly in the Arctic itself, however, this opens up about $35 trillion worth of resources that has never been able to be used before. Of these resources exists about a third of the world's untapped natural gas and about 15% of the world's oil, totaling about a quarter of the world's fossil fuels, as well as a massive amount of mineral resources. Control of natural resources is critical for establishing oneself as hegemon, both regionally and internationally. Now, as you can see here, most of the Arctic Circle is within Russia's exclusive economic zone, a 200 nautical mile radius from the coast, in which a country has, well, the exclusive rights to all the economic regions in the area, or resources in the area. However, this region right here, being claimed by Russia beyond their economic zone, is considered one of the most oil-rich places in the world. Now, if Russia were to be a Western democracy, this wouldn't necessarily be a concern to everybody today. It would actually be expected Russia would operate very similar to the way Canada does, focused on ecological protection rather than economic exploitation. However, Russia is a state that has always had a realist view of the world. Now, realism is a political ideology that emphasizes cutting down the competition, that focuses on power for the sake of power. Russian history is rife with leaders that have seen the world this way, leaders who've murdered their own family and conspired against other family members in order to take power and then spread their own power. This is in part due to the environment in which the Russian people have had to live. It's been extremely inhospitable and mostly frozen throughout most of Russian history. Today, though, former KGB operative Vladimir Putin, while he may advocate for democracy, his past and a lot of his current policies show a very different view of the world. He has been in charge of Russia in some form or another for the past 20 years. So understanding this explains a lot of why Russia is doing what they are doing in the region. Now, there's a number of benefits associated with climate change for Russia. As you can see in this map, everyone in the blue actually benefits economically from climate change, while those in red are negatively impacted by it. Russia, because of how large they are, where they are, and the way they see the world, actually has a lot more to gain than any of these other states. One of the massive benefits for Russia associated with climate change is the development of the North Sea route. Now, the North Sea route is a trade route that is almost entirely within Russian territory, and it's much shorter than the current route being used. It would cut travel time by about 5,000 miles and about a week. The reason this trade route isn't used as much is because of the associated cost with having to travel through the Arctic. There's a lot of money that has to go into developing in order to for a ship to be able to break the ice as it goes through, as well as outfitting for the equipment and the crew itself. The main focus for this route is going from East Asia, the world's largest producer and exporter, and getting to Western Europe, the world's largest consumer and the world's largest importer. Crossing through the Bering Strait requires about a $40 per ton fee for any ship, which is almost double what you normally have to pay going through any other strait. However, as you can see with the current route, there are multiple straits in which the ship would have to go through, meaning there's multiple tolls that you have to pay. So ships that cross through the North Sea route will still pay less in tonnage cost, and some of the weight that the ship has to use can now be used for marketable goods rather than fuel for the ship for an extra week or food for the crew or any of the equipment required. One of the other benefits of this trade route is the fact that all along the northern coast of Russia, there exists the possibility for most of these ports being opened for development with trade. Now, trade is critical to any modern economy because it provides an influx of capital from around the world. It means you're able to not just circulate money inside your country, you get to add extra money into it. Now, besides this, because of Russia's worldview, the world trade system being dependent on Russia would be extremely dangerous. Russia has a history of cutting off people from resources because they're doing something Russia does not agree with. In Siberia, which you can see here all in red and orange, there exists the potential for a massive amount of agricultural development. Currently, only about 10% of this land that you see, of this 5 million square miles, is available for agricultural development, which all exists roughly along the southern border of Siberia. As such, Russia has to depend on $28 billion worth of cultivated biological products from around the world. Now, what climate change would do is change that 10% to 50 to nearly 85% of Siberia, being open for agricultural development, and not just the spread of what Russia currently produces, but making it so that Russia has the ability to produce specialty products such as citrus and other cash crops. Now, again, with climate change moving climates, it also makes it so that the current regions of the world where food is mostly produced can no longer produce as much food, meaning Russia now will be able to have all of the food for not only themselves, but a lot of the world as well. As I mentioned earlier, this is a very bad thing for the rest of the world if you are dependent upon Russia. Now, Russia, in the dead of winter in 2006, Russia cut off all natural gas to the Ukraine because the Ukraine decided not to pay extra money that Russia wanted. Now, this was just talking about food and energy, or about heat and energy. If the world is dependent upon Russia for food, that couple month-long dispute will shorten to a matter of weeks, and you will be forced to pay, or else you will not be able to feed your people. Now, there's also a lot of mineral resources within the Russian Arctic that are all key to modern electronics and automobile development. Zinc, iron, platinum, palladium, all of these that you see here are total about $2 trillion worth of wealth for Russia. However, a lot of mining projects don't occur in the region, again, because of the massive cost associated with having to mine in such cold temperatures. Siberia typically in winter will reach temperatures as low as negative 58 degrees Fahrenheit. That's billions of dollars that companies have to put into outfitting the mining equipment as well as the people, as well as a certain protection cost for the people from the largest predator in the region. However, a melted Arctic leads to this cost being completely dropped off. That predator that I mentioned will die off. The cost associated with outfitting the equipment, with outfitting the crew, will drop, meaning that $2 trillion worth of resources will now be open for development because it will be cost effective. Now, the most lucrative of all of these benefits that I'm talking about, of course, is energy. Now, energy resources, as you can see here, all of this on the left of this line is within Russian territory. The darker the red, the more likely there is to be hundreds of trillions of gallons worth of gas or oil. Currently, Russia has the 8th largest oil reserve in the world, but with the advent of climate change and all of this being open for development, Russia will jump to being the 3rd largest in the world, behind Saudi Arabia and Venezuela. Russia does currently possess the largest natural gas reserves in the world, yet tapping into all of these resources will almost triple Russian output. Currently, Russia's investing $275 billion into the region to try and develop what they can already get a hold of. What this means is the more of these energy resources that Russia can tap into, the more Russia can sell to the rest of the world. The more Russia can sell, the more they can invest and develop. And urban development normally leads to higher local temperatures, meaning that all of this ice that is still there, if it hasn't already begun to melt, will melt, and it will melt much, much faster. Now, all of the other states within the Arctic follow a similar political ideology as Canada, focused on protection and ecological conservation rather than outright dominance or exploitation. So this competition between Russia and the West draws obvious parallels with the Cold War. In September of 2018, Russia, China, and Mongolia participated in the largest military exercise the world has seen since the Cold War. This was a couple 100,000 troops pretending to defend Russia against a land invasion. Less than a month later, NATO, plus Sweden and Finland, came together to participate in an extensive 31-nation exercise directly off of the Russian coast. Now, typically when NATO does military exercises protecting against some foreign aggressor, they use a fake name for the country. This name is almost always extremely obvious as to who it is you're talking about, but this exercise was one of the first times where NATO directly named Russia as the aggressor. Russia, of course, saw this as an affront to their sovereignty, as an attack on them. And when they made this clear to the world, the Secretary General of NATO essentially told Russia they could observe as long as they sat quietly and behaved themselves. Now, this is a very dangerous game that these two are playing because it increases the potential for conflict in this part of the world. Now, no discussion of any sort of military exercise or resource exploitation from a realist perspective is complete without an analysis of military deployment. Former Secretary of Defense James Mattis has been quoted as saying, the US certainly ought to up its game in the Arctic. This map from Senator Dan Sullivan of Alaska shows the 34 up-to-date military bases in the Russian north, as you can see all here. The other 6 states in the Arctic Circle possess 10 military bases total, meaning Russia has more than 3 times the military presence in the region. Now, many argue that the comparison to today in the Cold War are vastly overstated because there's a few hundred less aircraft and naval vessels on the Russian standpoint in the region than there were in the 1980s at the height of Soviet power. However, an analysis of what is actually being deployed and stationed in the region shows some of these fears actually might be slightly understated. Now, naval power is extremely important to emphasizing your strength on an international scale. There has been no global power without a strong navy. Ever since 1941, aircraft carriers and submarines were shown to be critical to naval strategy when a handful of carriers destroyed an entire fleet. The attack on Pearl Harbor not only just showed the power of the aircraft carrier, it also forced the American Navy to have to rework their strategy in regards to what ships they had because everything else they had was gone. All they had left were their 3 carriers and a couple submarines. But they were winning time and time again with these new strategies, with these new ships. So the purpose of an aircraft carrier is power projection in a very overt, very public manner. It's basically flexing your muscle as you send a massive ship that has who knows how many bombers and fighters directly off the coast of a country. It has the effect of intimidating a country into following order. While a submarine, on the other hand, is something very different. It may have slightly less destructive capability, but because you'll never know if there is a submarine off your coast, it instills a more consistent set of fear for whatever country that they might be having any sort of disagreement with. So understanding this explains why Russia is using their only aircraft carrier to help control and dominate the Arctic. This is the Kuznetsov class aircraft carrier, and it is the largest aircraft carrier in the world with the most capability for destructive power. The only submarine that is in the region as well is the Typhoon class, another Russian submarine, which again is the largest in the world and is actually one of the most capable of destruction. Currently, Russia is developing the Borei class submarine, and this is a submarine which, as you can see, has 4 extra ballistic missiles, and not only do they have more ballistic missiles, all of these missiles actually have a much larger throw weight, which means a much larger destructive capability. This is extremely dangerous for everyone in the region because it means Russia has the ability to use their military presence to push deeper and deeper into the Arctic Circle and dominate the entire region. Now, the easiest way to combat the Russian presence would be to combat climate change. However, a large portion of America's public is unknowingly influenced by Russian thought. Since early 2016, social media platforms were flooded with Russian bots and agents masquerading as American citizens, which led to the election of a climate change denier and his party into some of the highest positions of American government. Now, what this did, the reason this is important is this caused the American Environmental Protection Agency, the agency designed to, protect the environment, to no longer be allowed to have any reference or mention of any sort of man-made climate change. Overall, what this means is that the world is soon going to be facing a militarily emboldened, agriculturally and energy-independent Russia. A state with this realist worldview that I mentioned can actually end up having a large portion of the world dependent upon them, which is dangerous for everyone else. So the world has three different hegemonic outcomes. The least likely, which is the maintaining of the current American Western hegemony, the one most likely without the advent of climate change, which is a rising China based on the developing and marginalized world, and then the most likely with climate change in the world that we live in today is that of a Russia that is not dependent upon anyone else, but actually has the world dependent upon them. Thank you.
Thank you, Isaac. That was actually a very convenient segue into the next presentation. But first, I'd just like to thank you all for being here tonight, and I would like to thank Professor Sharkey from the Geography Department for giving me the contextual evidence on climate change as it pertains to socioeconomic issues. And I would like to thank Professor Huffman and Professor Morales, even though he couldn't be here tonight, for the opportunity to present tonight. On the issue of climate change, one of the issues that we're dealing with is water scarcity, and this is exactly what this paper talks about. In this paper, I argue that water scarcity is becoming increasingly relevant, and it's an increasingly relevant security concern due to the fact that resource scarcity in general often leads to conflict, competition, violence, and general instability in specific key regions in which we will talk about. Major world conflicts in history or even small civil disputes have often been the result of competition over scarce or vital resources. We see this, a pertinent example on the issue of oil. Oil is the primary supplier of global energy and is critical for development, and thus most industries and economies are incredibly dependent on the resource. This is one of the main reasons why so many wars have been fought over access to oil. And so in the same vein, water is also a critical resource for industries and economy, as well as necessary for proper development and obviously vital for life. In fact, 70% of the world's freshwater use is allocated for agriculture. 20% is used for industry, and about 10% is for municipal use. So if you're ever concerned whether your 20-minute shower is really affecting the global water supply, well, surely it is, but not nearly as much as agriculture and industry does have an effect on water supply. So water and oil are extremely comparable in this fashion. However, historically, water has never really been viewed as a source of conflict. The global community has actually now been forced to pay a keen eye to this issue in the face of climate change and overpopulation, being that the two in tandem significantly shrink the supply at an alarming rate. So with decreasing supply and increasing demand, the consequences of scarcity and what result from it has forced the global community to face the very real possibility that the next global wars will be fought over access to water. And so when we talk about this issue of water scarcity, one of the questions that comes up is, will we run out of water? The simple answer to this is no. We will never run out of water. The Earth is a closed system, which means no more water will ever be coming in than will be going out. We've always had the same amount of water. We will always continue to have the same amount of water. You can see by this picture, over 97% of the Earth's surface is covered in water. However, most of this water is salt water that is actually not usable or viable for humans or for what we use it for. So just nearly 70% of, well, actually, it's even a smaller figure, is fresh water, and 70% of that fresh water we can't even use because it's in glaciers, it's in ice caps, and so we use a very, very small percentage of waters in which we find in lakes and rivers. And this is really where the issue really evolves out of. 90% of all humans form populations or communities around a single source of water. And that's why water supply is shrinking so quickly, and most of the conflicts are stemming from these areas. Historically, we have retrieved water from lakes and rivers, and one of the biggest issues is that since 1970, global population has risen over 4 billion people, and simply we can't keep up with the demand. And so now we are seeing conflicts rising from these areas that are lacking water. And these areas we're going to refer to as transboundary conflict zones. So when we talk about transboundary conflict zones, transboundary nations are those countries in which share the same source of water. Actually, 3/4 of United Nations members all share rivers or lake basins. So this means about 145 countries just from the United Nations members alone share a single source of water. One of the largest issues regarding transboundary nations or waterways is that they're essentially lawless in terms of proper allocation, value, and control in the face of scarcity in specific. There are many UN treaties and resolutions that deal with water in terms of transportation. But there is not a lot of legislation which addresses proper allocation or equitability, and this is really what the main issue is. So when there's a dwindling supply and unequal control or allocation of water, it puts nations at odds with each other, and conflict between these countries quickly erupt. So to explore these effects, in particular, we focus on the region in the Lake Chad Basin, which is here, the Nile River, which is just a little north, and the Tigris and Euphrates Basin. And these areas are where we can see a lot of these conflicts already taking place, and how they relate to the issue of oil, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes. So to start, we go to the Lake Chad Basin, which is here, and you can see that Lake Chad is shared by 4 or 5 different countries. The Nile River goes through 11 countries, and the Tigris and Euphrates rivers are shared by 4 large countries. So to start with the Lake Chad Basin, this is a comparison photo from 1972 to 2007, and you can see that the Lake Chad Basin has shrunk to 1/10 of what it was in 1960. And more worrisome, according to Nigerian officials, the lake may completely dry up in the next 20 years. And so 2 main issues have really erupted from this situation. First, forced migration out of the region that have dried up has resulted in a series of conflict. One in particular is the fact that cattlemen are having to travel further distances to find water and fields for their cattle to graze, while at the same time they're encroaching on the land of farmers. And so you're seeing crops being destroyed, cattle being taken, and really what's resulted in this conflict is over 2,000 people have died in a bloody conflict between farmers and cattlemen, which seems like a small scale issue, but we'll start seeing more civil disputes like this in the next few decades. At the same time, migration out of these areas has led to an insurgence of military or terrorist organizations that have taken control over the abandoned regions. And so this is where we see militant groups such as Boko Haram, which is basically has led a huge insurgency, which has led to the death of over 27,000 people and over 2.4 million people displaced. So the conflict at the Lake Chad Basin has denoted this region of Africa one of the most horrific conflict zones in the country. And in the neighboring region of Africa, just up north at the Nile River, we see a similar situation happening, but of a different vein, just because it's a river, so it's a little bit of a different situation. So when we talk about the Nile River starts in Ethiopia and ends all the way in Egypt. One of the issues that we see here is unequal control of headwaters. Headwaters are basically where a river starts, and whoever has access to that has an access to a faster flowing move of water. And so we see countries who are water rich in these regions starting to build infrastructure in these regions. And in the case of the Nile River, Ethiopia has built the Grand Renaissance Dam, which is actually at just at the border of Ethiopia and Sudan. The water source, for that reason, is of contention a point of contention right now, because the large hydroelectric dam, has the potential to cut off the supply to Egypt for over a year. And this is because when you build a dam, you have to build up a reservoir behind the dam, and it would take about a year for the reservoir to build up, and thus would cut off the water supply to over 40 million farmers in Egypt. At the same time, this would allow Sudan to massively increase its supply before ever even reaching Egypt. So not only is the Nile the main source of water for over 40 million Egyptian people, it's also reaching a point to which the UN defines as absolute scarcity. And the definition is a condition that exists when there is not enough of a resource in existence to satisfy existing demand for it. And this is a situation that we're seeing even more commonly. So the combination of unspecified allocation and undetermined laws on unequal control of headwaters, areas in which dams are highly profitable, has been a hot spring of conflict. Regions such as Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Tanzania have all petitioned for redistribution of the water altogether, which even further slices the pie and decreases Egyptian supply even more. So in history, Egypt has stated its willingness to go to war with Ethiopia if the supply of water is ever barricaded. And so we already have a statement on what would happen if this issue continues to progress. If you go just a little bit north, there's a combination of the last two cases, and that's at the Tigris and Euphrates basin. So the Tigris and Euphrates rivers have been fought over for years. Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Turkey have been fighting over the region since the 1950s. So it's nothing new, but it's more stressful now, and there's more tension in the region because of increasing water scarcity. Similar to the situation at the Nile, Turkey has developed the Southeast Anatolia project, and this is comprised of 22 dams. This is an image of the dams, and you can see that they are constructed just here at the border of Syria and Iraq and Iran. This is of grave concern to both Syria, Iraq, and Iran because Turkey has already had a history of cutting off the water into Iraq in 1999 after the invasion of Kuwait. And so it's no real surprise that the dams have caused stress and instability in the region already. But just as terrorist groups or terrorist entities or militant groups in the Lake Chad Basin have capitalized on water conflicts, so too has ISIS in the region. In 2013, ISIS took control over Turkish Dam and cut off water supply to Syria's largest city in Aleppo, and it led to a huge humanitarian crisis in the region. In both Syria and Iraq, armed militias have begun to use water as a weapon for war. where they deliberately cut, pollute, or destroy the water supply altogether as strategies to exert pressure. At the same time, Japanese and Israeli climatologists predict that drought is likely to be permanent in this region. This is a region where this is a water source where it's sustained life for centuries, and it's likely to disappear in the upcoming century. And so now water has really become a real interest in terms of infrastructure investment, as we've seen in both Ethiopia and Turkey. And for this reason, water is even more now paralleled with oil than ever before. As visualized by these last few cases, it is evident that several countries are aiming to capitalize on the control of a diminishing resource by way of hydroelectric dams. But these few countries are not the only entities in which are focused on this same control. Huge investment banks such as Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan Chase, Citigroup, and Deutsche Bank are all consolidating their control over the water supply. This is because, simply put, water is a precious and scarce resource. In the next few years, it will be necessary to have water infrastructure in these regions. So this is really where water finds itself at the core of an infrastructure super trend. And this is really of concern not only to these specific regions that we've talked about, but really to all water-dependent nations, which is everyone. So we have seen wars that have resulted from unequal dominance over the resource-rich countries which have dominated the market. We felt the effects when the resources are politicized. During the 1973 OPEC oil embargo, dependent oil countries suffered high rates of inflation, huge increase on oil prices, and less access to the product altogether. So if investment bankers or water-rich nations attain the same control over water, such as Ethiopia and Turkey are already starting to do, the effects of disputes over water won't just be felt by the surrounding regions, it will really be felt by the entire global community. And incidentally, every single human on the planet. So wars and conflict over oil breeds in 8 distinct ways, and we can use these as a framework to really see how conflict over water can breed in the same way that conflict over oil already has. And so that brings us to the distinct ways in which conflict is bred over oil, and you can just substitute the word oil for water, and the same scenario plays out. So for the first, oil is a source of conflict for resource wars. It's basically where states trying to acquire oil reserves by force. We've seen this several times in history, and so it would not be uncommon to see water fought over in the same way. The second would be petroaggression, whereby oil insulates aggressive leaders such as Saddam Hussein or Ayatollah Khomeini for domestic opposition. And therefore makes them more willing to engage in risky foreign policy. And really the list goes on, but for this specific scenario, we really focus on number 4, 5, and 6. Financing for insurgencies, we've already seen the evidence in the case studies of terrorist organizations capitalizing on abandoned regions, such as the Lake Chad Basin or ISIS in Syria. For 5, conflicts triggered by the prospect of oil market domination. We already see this, such as Egypt already stating they'd go to war with Ethiopia if the water was ever barricaded. And 6, clashes over control of oil transit routes. You can just think of this oil transit routes as rivers. These exact issues have already been developing at these transboundary states where the construction of dams cause significant concerns to nations and really cause a lot of a source of conflict. So really, what can be done about this situation, and how can we use the framework to implement policy that really works in regards to water? Well, one of the main reasons that it's so difficult to establish successful policy, and there is policy out there, it's not that it doesn't exist, but it's extremely difficult to establish parameters for water in the context of use, development, protection, and conservation, because in places like India or South Africa, water crises are often attributed to lack of government planning, increased privatization, industrial waste, and government corruption. So at the same time, water is also seen as a basic human right. And so it's really trying to assign a value to something that you really can't assign a value to. It would be, and I'm sure we've all had the thought of how much would it cost if they started charging us to breathe air. And so that's really the same situation. How much does water cost? Well, right now we know that water is extremely cheap. It's very scarce, but the price doesn't really change. And that's really because everything in this room is a product of water. And so if you increase the price of water, you would essentially increase the price of the shirt on your back, the shoes you're wearing, the belt, the cameras, the walls, everything would increase in price. And this is a really big issue that has to be addressed and it's really taking into consideration how you value something that is a human right. But this is really what has to be done, is revaluing water in the face of scarcity, because if it's not, without policies to allocate finite supplies of water more effectively or efficiently, water stress will intensify where water is already scarce and spread to all regions throughout the world. And so it's something that we really need to pay closer attention to before these crises outbreak everywhere, and not just in the African regions and not just in the Middle East, because they will come home sooner than you think. Thank you.